Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Thinking Out Loud podcast. For today's episode, we have Austin Carson. He's a professor here at UChicago of political science, and his focus is on surveillance systems and intelligence agencies and how the secret side of international politics works with the non-secret side of international politics. And he's a great professor. I'm taking this class right now, so I thought it'd be interesting to bring him on and talk a little bit about his research and about how the world of secret agencies work. So, Professor, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So I'm an associate professor in the political science department. I've been at University of Chicago for about 10 years. A lot of my work is on, like you said, the secret side or sort of the backstage of international politics. I long have thought that that's an important aspect of international politics, but didn't see a lot of scholarship on it when I was in graduate school many years ago. Did a dissertation kind of project that was based on that, and then have done further research after that, turned that into a book. I've done articles on it, wrote another book on it. Now I'm writing a third book on it, more or less. It's been something that remains really interesting to me, and it's been fun to design a class around it to teach. And to sort of mentor students in writing projects paper projects that are about it. So, yeah, that's kind of a lot of what I'm doing here at the university.
Awesome. So you mentioned the book you wrote. You wrote the book Secret Wars, and on it you talk about pieces of the intelligence agencies in overt wars, like wars that we see not being intelligence, and you talk about why countries choose to act in a secret way in these circumstances. So. One of the case studies that you put there is of Soviet pilots and American pilots during the Korean War, and they were shooting each other down, and both knew about it. Both countries knew about it, and they chose not to go overt with that operation. And just more briefly, can you talk a little bit about what the book is about and what's the argument it put out? Because I think it's really interesting to just bring it up to the audience.
For sure. So the book basically tries to understand both the nature of what governments do covertly or secretly in modern wars, and why they do it in that way rather than in a more overt or public way, and what the consequences of that are. And so, so a good example to kind of like flesh out some of the core topics and arguments in the book is this Korean War episode. Where the United States was fighting in that war overtly, very publicly, was defending South Korea from an attack by North Korea.
Right.
But eventually the United States and its allies were so successful in defeating North Korea that North Korea's allies, both China and the Soviet Union, had to provide support to North Korea for it to stay in the war and have a fighting chance, basically. And the Soviets decided to do their participation in the war on a covert basis. So they, in a really interesting sort of detail, they basically sent Soviet pilots in Chinese uniforms or North Korean uniforms, and they flew planes that had Chinese and North Korean markings, rather than coming in with sort of the official regalia and insignia of the Soviet Air Force. And so the book tries to explore sort of like, why would the Soviets be so afraid to come in publicly? And then there's a sort of set of steps after that. Sort of, what does the other side do when it observes this sudden change in the quality of the combat operations of their enemy? Like, well, this is suspicious.
This guy's speaking Russian.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things the book talks about is that the United States, or any country in that sort of role where there's covert participation on the other side, they tend to figure it out pretty quickly because they're very curious and concerned about who's doing what and in what capacity. And so the U.S. figures out through, in part, intercepting the radio communications between pilots and their sort of ground control stations that are all conducted in Russian at a certain point. And they realize that so these are different kinds of pilots. And the Americans then have a decision about whether to present that information publicly to basically out the Soviets as having joined the war. And they don't do that. It's a pretty dramatic example of how there's almost a kind of collusive secrecy where both sides are staying quiet about certain aspects of a war, in this case the Korean War. because both of them, in many cases, but not all, but both of them had, in this case, an interest in keeping this war limited. And so by the Soviets coming in covertly, that helped keep the war just on the Korean Peninsula and not a wider war, not the start of a major war between the U.S. and Soviet Union directly.
Right.
And by the U.S. kind of playing its role and keeping it quiet as well, you had this sort of balance between the two, where they were willing to fight each other, but on a limited basis and on the backstage. And that, in turn, helped keep the Korean War, and not World War III.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because when people talk about intelligence and talk about espionage operations, they tend to assume it's something inherently bad. But in this case, you talked about seems like this use of covert action stopped a major war from brewing up.
Yeah.
So do you see how do you see the perception of people of covert actions differing from what really what's the reality of it?
I mean, that's part of what I was motivated in doing, is I felt like the easy way to sort of think about these issues is that if you're doing it secretly, if you're mucking around in a foreign war, then what you're doing is sort of neo-imperial. It's normatively bad and it's dangerous. And to be clear, I think that there's some real truth to that. So I'll come to a more balanced perspective, in a second. But I was first drawn to the idea that, hey, like, this is actually a use of secrecy that has a sort of more normatively positive flavor to it, where, these are two governments who are essentially using the manipulation of information and acknowledgement of who's doing what in the war as a way to contain the scale and scope of violence. And a much larger war beyond Korea would have been one in which a lot of people would have suffered, and there would be a danger of even potentially the use of atomic weaponry or something if it became a full-scale war. So there's a sort of positive flavor to it. Now, the reason I think it's, when you take a grand tally of what's going on here, there is a downside to it, which is that, if both sides know that you can come in secretly and the other side might not draw attention to it, in a way it sort of opens the door to that very entry, that covert intervention, that covert action. It kind of permits it. It makes it more less costly to do that. And so I think there is a downside to it, where the use of secrecy allowed the Soviets to enter the war and change the nature of the war in a way that, isn't necessarily great. But at the same time, it helped contain it from becoming a larger war. And so there's a positive to it too.
Yeah, and something that's interesting that we talk about in class, sort of the negative of the covert action, is it's really hard to keep politicians accountable.
Exactly.
Of course, the USSR is like, they weren't a democracy, though, so there was no way to keep them accountable at all. But in this case, the Americans were also partaking in that.
Absolutely.
And, for example, not sharing that the Soviets were at war, that could be a duty of the executive office that they were not doing. In other cases, like the Pentagon Papers, it's a more glaring example of the U.S. not disclosing what they were doing in Vietnam, and not disclosing, but completely understating what they were doing there.
Misleading,
Yeah. So how do you see this display between the benefits of secrecy and covert action? Because, of course, there are benefits. For example, the attack in Iran or the attack in Venezuela could never have happened without covert action, without secrecy. How do you balance that with, people's trust in government and the ability of democracy to properly function?
Yeah, so I think as part of my interest in writing that book was to think through what I think is a really complicated set of issues and trade-offs when we think about the role of secrecy in a democratic foreign policy. And so just to put a finer point on it, you're exactly right. Like, in the Korean War, the United States was literally lying to the American people about who was fighting in the war and who was responsible for the deaths of American pilots, for example. And that's, so on the one hand, okay, we use this tool to potentially help contain a war from becoming a much larger one. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, that required lying to the American people.
Right.
That's something that's a bad thing, probably, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I think is important to understand, is that there are these trade-offs. And so, so I think, at times there's ways of trying to minimize the degree to which there's a trade-off. So, for example, you could, something we talked about in class just recently
Mm-hmm.
is you could put a kind of timer on the use of secrecy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, the United States and the Soviets can stay quiet about certain aspects of the war, but when the war's over, do we come clean and do we say, okay, this
Mm-hmm.
is actually what happened, right? We want to tell you, like, your son or your daughter was actually part of combat operations that were engaging Soviet pilots, and that's the actual context in which they were injured or even killed. That would be sort of the principle behind what a lot of democracies do, which was created, like I said, create a timer for secrets, which
Mm-hmm.
means over time they declassify and basically come clean about things that have been hidden before for
Mm-hmm.
intelligence purposes or for this sort of covert aspect of war that we're talking about. And that's one way to at least reduce the tension between, because then you can say, okay, as a democratic polity, we learn the truth, maybe with a delay, but we eventually learn the truth. Now, to kind of underscore the degree to which this isn't a perfect solution, like we didn't find out, we as in
U.S.
public confirmation by the U.S. government about these aspects of the Korean War, that didn't come until after the end of the Cold War. That didn't
Mm-hmm.
come. The real declassification of materials that I used in that research for that book, really the large majority of those materials didn't come out until 50 years after the war.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that's a timer, but it's a
Really
timer
hard to
set
keep
to
people
a,
accountable when
yeah,
they're dead.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. So they're dead,
Uh-huh.
or some of the participants in the war were still alive but very old.
Yeah.
And the complete, the geopolitical situation had completely changed at that point, right? Part
Yeah.
of the reason they could do it was because it was the end of the Cold War. And so, basically the situation's totally changed. So in practice, you had a half century
Mm-hmm.
of an uninformed public about one aspect of the Korean War. And I think you can see versions of that playing out, maybe not as dramatic, where, you've got people who are killed and it's not clear, who was responsible for it, but even less, more mild examples where the truth of covert action or the truth of the secret side of war in democracies like the United States is not fully revealed for decades until after the fact. And
Mm-hmm.
are we really, do we really want to consider that
Yeah.
a restoration of the principle of information and transparency in a democracy, or is that simply just too long after the fact?
Yeah. It's more like an abstract question, but
Mm-hmm.
how much do we think we not know about what really happened in, let's say, the Iraq War, the last, the post 9/11 world? Like, how much are we so far off? Because, for example, this is like an internal affair, but Snowden just
Yeah.
showed how much we didn't know
Yeah.
about U.S. access to information
Yeah.
on its own citizens.
Yeah.
Do you think that's still happening, or do you think we're just completely how far off the ball are we?
Yeah. I mean, I think once you go down this road, it's tempting to start to think like,
Everything's a conspiracy.
it's all we
Yeah.
know is the tip of the iceberg,
Right.
right? And everything, the truth is this giant mass of ice below the water, like all these things that are hidden from us. And I jokingly refer in our class to like putting on the tinfoil hat, and like this. It's tempting to do, and so I fight against that impulse a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times, where I can kind of look at like the research I've done for that book, but many other projects over the last 15 years, and you can learn two lessons, right? Like you can say, wow, look at all these instances, these concrete moments where when you look at the records, you can point to and find aspects of the truth that were not available until decades later. And so, yeah, there's an iceberg submerged, right?
Uh-huh.
But then there's like many other like rumors or things that you might imagine to be true that you don't find confirmation of,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you go and dig around in the records, and in Vietnam there was more than was publicly confirmed a role of China, of the Chinese in the Vietnam War. And specifically, just to give a little detail, like the United States was bombing the main transportation routes, basically the highways that were linking North Vietnam with China. And so when the U.S. bombed those, the Chinese couldn't get supplies to the North Vietnamese that they needed for the North Vietnamese to stay in the war and survive, basically. So the Chinese sent in construction units to rebuild these highways. But those, if they just sent in the construction units and nothing else, those Chinese personnel would just be killed by the next round of bombing.
Right.
So they sent in air defense units to prevent those construction teams from being killed by American bombing. So that actually led to some, exchanges and combat encounters between Chinese forces and American forces in Vietnam. It's something I talk about in Secret Wars in the chapter on Vietnam. But you can look at that in two ways, right? Like, oh, the Chinese were involved in ways we didn't, wasn't fully acknowledged and admitted to and publicized during the war. Okay, but the Chinese also had a zillion things they could have done but didn't do in the Vietnam War. Like, they didn't participate in the air war in the way the Soviets did in the Korean War.
Right.
And they didn't participate in the ground combat other than this, specific application. And so, the tinfoil hat would say, what else did the Chinese do? But I looked at the documents. I didn't see them do anything other than this more targeted, and that's still significant.
Right, of course.
But there are many things they didn't do, and I think there's two lessons there for there are things that we don't know about, and there's lots of things that we can imagine that actually don't happen.
Mm-hmm. Something that I find to be interesting is that, the U.S. really didn't declare war. Like, the last time we declared war was in 1941 against the Japanese.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that, let's say especially since the early 2000s after 9/11, we just started using a lot of intelligence resources to plan more specific and targeted attacks.
Yeah.
Say Libya, recently in Iran, Venezuela.
Yes.
These types of attacks could only happen because of intelligence, because of American access to information that we wouldn't have otherwise. But those are still not considered proper acts of war. Right? So how do you draw the balance between what was caused, like actions that were caused by intelligence but were overt, and just full out blown out war? Is it just a perception, or is there something structurally different?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two issues to kind of pull apart there. It's what is the role of intelligence and surprise and basically the capacity of secrecy in a democracy to engage in sort of limited special operations style uses of military force. And I think we've had a lot of examples recently, and we've talked about them in our class because they've kind of overlapped with the class in Venezuela and the two different attacks on Iran in the last 12 months, right? The summer ones, 2025 summer attacks by the United States, Operation Midnight Hammer, and then we have the current Operation Epic Fury, ongoing war in Iran. There's a lot of surprise and secrecy, intelligence locating leaders, cyber actions that disrupt air defense and help enable entry and exit from a country. So there's a lot of that going on, and I think we've talked about it, and I think about it as useful reminders that effective military operations require a lot of planning, a lot of intelligence, and a lot of the capacity for secrecy. That is in tension with, obviously, the general principle in democracies of public information. But the other thing you alluded to is something a little bit different, which in my mind, which is, overt publicly acknowledged uses of military force. And what do we call them? And do we call them war? And do we declare war? And importantly, does Congress declare war, since that's what is a constitutional power in the U.S. Constitution? And that, to me, there's a whole other problem there, which is a lack of honesty about what it is the United States is oftentimes up to. Not calling wars to me is not sort of confronting the reality and the gravity of what's going on. And so I think, after 9/11 especially, there's been a congressional act to authorize the use of military force, which is not the same thing as saying war or declaring war, but in essence has provided a sort of blanket permission to the executive branch to engage in these sort of limited, more short-term, more discrete acts, military acts. But, I think a lot of people, including me, feel like those individually or collectively constitute going to war.
Right.
And we haven't done that and called it that in the way that I think we did back in World War II. And there's reasons behind that, legal and strategic and others, but it is something that I think a lot of people are having second thoughts about in terms of critiques of these unending forever wars and things like that. It's sort of like what are we up to here? What have we walked ourselves into without really saying it?
Right. And ever since 9/11, we just exploded our capacity in intelligence. We just the NSA was way more heavily funded. So was CIA. So was the FBI. Of course, DHS was created. That's not really intelligence related, but still, how much do these new intelligence sources are actually useful to American actions nowadays? And I guess my question is, with what we have today, could we have prevented 9/11 or this types of attacks? Is this enough, or is this overkill at this point?
Well, I think there's an important caveat in any kind of question like this, which is there's only so much you and me can figure out,
too much,
because you know what I mean, because we're not on the inside, and one of the sort of fundamental problems in studying this kind of topic is that there are many intelligence successes that those of us outside of the intelligence community, we never learn about those. There are plots for terror attacks that are thwarted that never get discussed. And what we tend to see are the intelligence failures. We've talked about this in class. You tend to see the intelligence failures.
There's a huge survivorship bias.
Exactly. So I tend to find it hard to say, well, do we have enough? Could we prevent something like that? Hard to say unless you have that denominator, the total number of incidents that could have happened but didn't. So that's sort of one caveat. But I think, I think there have been huge changes in both the amount of resources, the legal authorities to collect intelligence, and the technology. I mean, I think about what I've been reading, just as a quick example, right? So there's been reporting just in the last week about the role of AI, artificial intelligence.
I was going to ask about that.
Specifically Claude and Anthropic's tools that have been integrated into apparently and reportedly, how they at least suggest targets that the United States in Iran could target, and they're drawing on huge volumes of both sort of imagery as well as other sources of information, collating that information all together, and sort of again saying this could be a potential valuable target. Well, just imagine if we had those tools right in the year 2000 or 2001 before September, connecting the dots like we read about with Amy Ziegart's book on some of the things that contributed to the failure to prevent 9/11. I imagine AI and Claude with access to a bunch of information streams would be able to put together something might be happening. And so in that sense, maybe these investments have produced a level of intelligence awareness that makes that kind of complex attack really hard to pull off without being detected ahead of time. Now, does that mean we've done enough? Is it too much? That's hard to say, and worth talking about if you want. But I think again, connecting some of the reporting about the operations in Iran right now with AI and what happened in 9/11, it seems like that dot connecting is exactly, with multiple streams of information, that's exactly what AI is sort of contributing right now.
Yeah, and on the topic of AI, I think it's interesting because Claude said, Anthropic said that the deal fell through because the U.S. government wanted to use Claude to operate pretty much autonomous weapons, and they wanted to. And Claude said, "Hey, we're not ready for that yet. Yeah, it's not what the system is designed for." So they pulled back on the deal. How much, are we at risk of losing control of what we do with our own intelligence at this point?
I think the answer is yes, but what I mean by that is I don't like to portray technology as a runaway train, as having basically there has to be a bureaucratic and political decision to authorize, to go from a suggested target to an automated firing of a kinetic weapon at that target in order for us to lose control. But because we made that decision to link up a suggested target to making it a target, yes,
Yeah.
and to link it up with a weapon system where we're saying, yes, you also
You have the
have
authorization.
the authority
to do it,
to use that. And it would have to be a weapon system, I guess, for this to be fully non-human out of a human out of the loop. It would have to be like a drone or something, right?
Right.
Like we made a bunch of decisions to get there. So did we lose control, or did we choose
To give
to
it up,
give
yeah.
it that capability? And I think that's a really important difference, and it gets at that dispute reportedly between Anthropic and the DoD, where one side is not comfortable with that, the other side maybe is either exploring that or interested in that, wants to do that, or at least wants to have that option, or doesn't want to have rules basically or constraints from the AI technology source. But I think we're approaching that capability, or maybe we're already there. Yeah, but the question again to me is we get to decide about this, right? Like no AI system right now has a gun or has a missile capability.
Oh, thank God.
They just pump out words, process information, and provide suggestions, summaries, ideas, whatever. They're powerful things, but they're just words. They're just thoughts, or not even really thoughts. They're recombined ideas and insights, and to connect that with the very unique power to kill. That's a decision we get to make, hopefully.
Right. And something I think is really interesting is that, of course, that's something I heard from the side of the government in this deal, this quasi deal, was that China, they're developing their own AIs, and they're using the best AI models in intelligence. Of course, not as you said, not to fire weapons, as far as we know. Who knows?
I don't know. Yeah.
But who knows? And Russia is doing the same. They're using all these models for that. And the argument was that Claude is, today one of the most advanced ones, and not having the military access to that is weakening our positioning. How this is about AI, but like broadly about the surveillance system. How different is our covert strategy and our secret apparatus compared to countries like Russia, China, our peer rivals?
I think the fundamental question then is in comparing the use of AI and the sort of overall capability, intelligence capabilities, and potential for the U.S. versus say China or a Russia. I think about it along two lines, like the guardrails and the technology or capability. Like I think on the technology and capability side, the United States benefits greatly from the fact that the leading edge of AI capabilities, processing capabilities, storage capabilities, computing capabilities, the infrastructure, and the software, the hardware and the software. The more those are with American companies, the more the United States will be out in front of even a China or a Russia,
right?
Because of its ability to collaborate with actors like Anthropic or OpenAI or whatever. So I think on the capability side, my guess is that the U.S. For surveillance or other applications is ahead of all other countries in a lot of places, and certainly wants to be. On the guardrail side, this gets at this issue of are there things that the United States, by law, by bureaucratic choice, or because of technology suppliers and their own decision making, things are taking off the table the Chinese and the Russians wouldn't necessarily take off the table. And I think that's like a real tricky issue because, maybe there are qualms or concerns that are not shared or are seen as optional in other countries, and maybe applications and uses that they're willing to go to that the U.S. wouldn't. Mass surveillance, like the sort of Snowden disclosures, right? Like would the same kind of disclosure and the same outrage would not necessarily happen in a Russia or a China.
Right.
You don't have a free media. You don't have leaks that are tolerated for the most part seemingly, and the reaction would be very different. And so I imagine that there are certain things, certain applications and uses that the United States is slower to embrace or doesn't embrace at all. And that's just, I suppose, part of the the way the U.S. approaches power is that not every use or potential
Mm.
is ultimately worth it.
Yeah. Something you said is interesting that the U.S. has the upper hand on technology, um, and we share it with our allies mostly. You know, for example, we had great cooperation with Israel to do the strikes in Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
and of course we have the Five Eyes. We have NATO corporations for intelligence. Of these intelligence sharing mechanisms like the Five Eyes, these NATO circles of sharing. Uh, what do you think? How do you balance the downside of having just giving away information to a country that it's your ally but may not be, or just blindly trusting them that way?
Yeah.
How do you balance that with the ability of having extra information? Like, what's the
Yeah, well, I think the end of your question gets at what I have seen a lot in research I've been doing more recently. So I've been working on a book that looks at
infrastructure,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
infrastructure of intelligence collection, and so these many modern technical systems, whether it uses imagery, video, but especially intercepting signals and communications, which is a huge part of what the U.S. and its allies do. It requires physical facilities in particular places. Um, in order to collect that intelligence. And what that creates is this sort of sprawling set of relationships between, in the case that I look at in a lot of depth in this book, the United States and those countries that are willing to allow the U.S. to build and operate a facility or co-operate it or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen in doing the research for that is that there's always sort of like a bargain going on here. There's always a deal
Mm-hmm.
being had. It's not the United States sharing information with its allies just sort of willy-nilly or on a trusty basis.
Right.
It's part of a nested set of each side doing something for the other. And sometimes it's simply a partner might allow you to use part of its territory to collect intelligence or do other things. And in exchange, you provide access to information, or you help train them in particular kinds of intelligence collection. I've seen that as a particular kind of example of this kind of deal making. So I think the U.S. overall is engaged in a set of sort of win-win, probably for the most part, bargains
Mm-hmm.
with individual countries and with groups of countries that provide the U.S. capabilities and raw information. And then in exchange, the U.S. provides them with know-how, raw information, capabilities, and other kinds of kind of interlinked intelligence and security arrangements. That's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because for your class, like the paper that I'm writing is about American espionage and the British
Yeah.
during the World War II and how that led to the Bretton Woods Agreement
Mm-hmm.
and sort of the rise of the dollar as a reserve currency, and that's something like the British were our allies, right? That's something like when I started doing like this research was like how much intelligence the Americans have on their own
Yeah.
allies, like
Yeah.
why are they not fully focusing on Japanese or on the Germans or even the Soviet Union, because sure they're socialists, so you might have a, a problem with them in the future, so that'd be kind of a smart idea, but I guess it's really interesting like how much intelligence how much of the focus of our intelligence agencies are aimed at our allies, because it doesn't need to be a covert action. Again,
No,
in
no.
this example that
Yeah.
in my paper, uh, it wasn't like anything like a covert action. It was just the access to extra information on the British
Oh,
were
yeah.
key to making those deals with the British at the end of the
Absolutely.
war. So how much of our resources do you think go to these
I
types
think
of
it's
operations?
a surprisingly large amount, right?
Really?
Yeah, I think the lesson you learned in doing that research, you can expand that.
Right.
And the reason is that, and again, to clarify, we are not talking about covert action necessarily. We're
Right.
really talking about intelligence collection and intelligence analysis. What proportion of resources are spent on your bad guy adversaries versus your allies? And the thing I've learned from my own research echoes exactly what you found in your paper, which is that the U.S. spends a surprising amount tracking what's going on in its allies, and it's for a lot of really good reasons. I'll give you there's lots of examples. So, one of the research projects that I've done in the last 5 years has used this really interesting document, the President's Daily Brief, which was like the morning intelligence summary that was given to the president. A bunch of these were declassified from the 60s and 70s, like all of them, with some redactions within them.
Right.
And in these President's Daily Briefs, you get a sense of what the intelligence community is tracking. And there are many intelligence daily morning summaries where half the material is about allies. It's about, here's who we think is going to win the next election in France. It's about, here's a scandal that the Australian Prime Minister is dealing with, and how it might affect the U.S.-Australian relationship. It's about, here's, just take something from my book project, here's the risk of an independence movement forming on the island of the Azores in Portugal. And the implications that would have for U.S. military logistics and intelligence collection, which we had a lot going on from the Portuguese control of that island. And so because the U.S. is its security and its infrastructure, to again build on things I've been thinking about, is so intertwined with its allies, then things happening in its allies really matter to U.S. national security.
Right.
And so you devote intelligence collection resources, both human and technological, and you devote intelligence and analytic attention. And you can find whole national intelligence estimates and memos that are trying to analyze where the winds are blowing domestically within a host of different allies. And I think what people assume is that you're watching your enemies and you're trusting your allies.
Right.
But because the allies are so much a part of the American approach to grand strategy and national security, you're paying attention to allies too. And just to give like a contemporary example, like what's going on in Israel? What is Israel going to do in Gaza?
Right.
Is Israel going to attack Iran? Under what conditions? With what target sets?
But how much of that is like does Israel give us?
Well, there's a lot.
How much do we collect, for example?
But what I think is interesting about the U.S.-Israel relationship is if you look at the declassified materials from the Cold War, there's stuff going back and forth that Israel's volunteering to the United States, but the U.S. is also like double checking the math,
right,
and doing some of its own homework, if that makes sense, because maybe what Israel's sharing isn't the full truth, right, and because what Israel does affects U.S. interests and U.S. personnel, U.S. diplomats. I mean, we're seeing right now American installations, military and diplomatic, being attacked,
right?
During this war with Iran. So what Israel does affects the safety of Americans as well as American interests in the Middle East. And so you want to have your own sort of parallel set of information sources and analysis on a country like Israel, even though you may also at the same time be planning a war together that you're going to launch in, say, 2026.
Have to double check that. Right. Something I wanted to ask you is like, let's say, for example, the U.S. has a policy of ambiguity towards Taiwan.
Sure.
Right, and that's a great part of our strategy because we don't want to have Taiwan just rely on us, completely. So, for example, let's say China decides to invade. And with this policy of ambiguity, like, let's say we're debating whether to help them or not. What are the first steps in covert action that we could do to help them without fully entering the war? Or not only the Taiwan case, but for example, the same case with Israel and Iran, right? We didn't fully declare war in Iran, or we didn't. In the case of the war in June or last summer. Israel and Iran were bombing each other for a couple of weeks until we did something about it. So what are, when we don't have a formal commitment to security, what are the first steps of covert action that can be used to help our allies?
Well, the example I think of that comes to mind for me is looking at, what's been learned about the U.S. in Ukraine.
Right.
Before the Russian invasion, after the Russian invasion. So there's a lot of things the U.S. can do without joining the fight, which are related to the secret side of international politics, which are related to both intelligence and covert action. So just one good concrete example is like intelligence, high quality intelligence about the enemy attacking this partner of yours, right? So the U.S. doesn't let's say the U.S. is still debating whether to defend Taiwan with American naval and other air assets, let's say. while it's debating that, it could share a huge amount of intelligence with the Taiwanese to help them more effectively repel the Chinese amphibious landing. Okay,
Right.
so that's one example, and that's what the one role the United States has played with Ukraine, and there's been debates about how much, and how much information inside of Russia does the U.S. want to provide intelligence about. But like targeting information and intelligence on the adversary is a really useful thing to an actor like a Ukraine or like an Israel or like a Taiwan, which falls short of actually joining the war. So I think that's like one important one that we've seen in a number of places. The other idea that comes to mind is, what about covert cyber operations? So if the United States is still debating whether to use overt naval and air assets to help defend Taiwan in this scenario, maybe something the U.S. would do right out of the gate would be a number of cyber operations to hinder, slow down, at the maximum, cripple the command and control and operational communication and other logistics of a Chinese amphibious operation. The U.S. could do that on a covert basis. That sort of sand in the gears that certain kinds of cyber operations can create wouldn't necessarily be observable to outsiders. If it was, who did it wouldn't necessarily be observable. Who knows? The Taiwanese might have that capability, or it could just be the friction that comes with like a complicated amphibious operation. So it would be deniable. It could potentially have substantial effects depending on the capabilities, and it would give the U.S. time to decide whether it wanted to come into the war in a more overt and fulsome way. So I think again, that builds on some of the reporting on what the U.S. was able to do in the Ukrainian context, where cyber operations on a covert basis against Russia might have been part of the response even before the United States was able to decide on other things.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Ukrainian-related documents are all classified because the war's still going on. So it's hard to find out.
Yeah. This is more like New York Times, Washington Post,
Right.
Wall Street Journal, exposés, Reuters. There's been some deep dives, and we've learned some stuff.
But apart from the aid that we give him, and the ammunition, the all the military equipment that we give him, do you think? You said intelligence was a big part of it. You said perhaps cyber. Is there anything else that comes to mind? No, or is that just putting a tinfoil hat? It's like.
It's not tinfoil hat. So territory, I guess, to me, it's
is there a secret war that we could be seeing right now?
Yeah. So sometimes you can go to tinfoil and you're like, okay, who's flying the planes? Like who's No,
I'm not claiming that. I'm just
I know, but you can start wondering. I think, but of course we don't know. Like you said, it's hard to verify any of this, and I would be surprised if there was not a layer of support that the United States was providing to Ukraine on a covert basis that goes beyond the publicly acknowledged forms of support. I think that the way to answer this to me with sort of intellectual integrity and not with the tinfoil hat is to say, historically, if you look at other conflicts where there is a small state with a large patron, and this could be North Korea and the Soviet Union, or it could be Ukraine and the United States. Typically, there's the amount of support by that larger supporting power on the backstage exceeds, by some margin, not necessarily a huge amount, but exceeds what is being done on an overt or public basis, because the temptation is to help. You want to only go so far for a variety of reasons on an overt public basis, but then you might be able to go a little bit further and help out a little bit more, but push that envelope without public acknowledgement. And so, so does the U.S. have? I think there has been public reporting that the U.S., like the CIA and other sort of clandestine service components of the United States have physical presence in Ukraine. What they're doing, I don't know. What they might be doing is helping make specific units more effective. They might be providing advice and providing guidance. in ways that exceed. It's not quite participating in war. They're not on the front lines, but it's probably going further than just giving, here's a weapon, if you know,
Right.
here's how to use it, and now use it this way and this way and here and here. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. So
Okay.
so again, like, don't want to go into the tinfoil speculation, but I think the broad lesson, based in part on the reporting about Ukraine, but also on historical patterns, is that um, the envelope tends to get pushed furthest on the backstage, but there are still limits, right? There again, the U.S. is not going to wage Ukraine's air war and hope nobody finds out.
Yeah, we're not gonna bomb Putin.
Exactly, we're not going to bomb
Kremlin, yeah.
Moscow on a covert basis and be like, oh, hopefully they'll attribute it to the Ukrainians, and we'll, or
Right.
even if they find out it's us, they'll stay quiet about it. I think, even when done covertly, there are still many scenarios where escalation and other concerns can dissuade an actor from doing things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We're running out of time here, but I have another question that I was
Sure.
curious about. You published like numerous papers. You wrote a book. You're writing another book, and you advise on many different papers from students from other authors and other universities. What's something that most surprised you about this field of intelligence, of secrecy? What's the thing, when coming into the field, like more than a decade ago, what's something you never expected to learn that you did?
Yeah, I think the
Can be an empirical thing, can be like a
I'll give you one thing from two buckets. I think I had a hunt. The first thing is about just the potential overall of what we can learn from materials, not just declassified by the United States by law, but pockets of materials that are available, like say about Nazi Germany. Records are seized at the end of the war, published. You can learn a lot about how an authoritarian regime operates if you study those documents. So there's different kinds of documents from different governments in different eras, but sort of studying this sort of like backstage type material, right? These declassified primary documents. I've just been amazed with how much there is to learn. There's sort of like
infinite.
a lifetime and more could be spent just reading and learning little nuances and maybe even big facts that are not part of the conventional historical interpretation of events or the body of evidence and facts that we have about everything from intelligence collection to covert action to specific famous wars to diplomatic agreements to the Brentwood system.
Right.
So I think the big, one answer to your question is just how exciting and how much potential there is. And I teach a class, every year on this. And so between 25 and 50 students, depending on the size of the class, are writing 25 or 50 different papers every year. And still every year, it's a bunch of new interesting things to learn, because once you drill down and you get specific about what you want to research, as long as you're able to access some records for that topic, there tends to be lots of things to learn. So I think that's sort of like the broad, not a specific substantive finding, but more just like, there's so much to do here. And working on this book now on intelligence infrastructure, it's like I could work on this for another 10 years and spend 1 year on the U.S. presence in Ethiopia, 1 year on the emergence of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean as an intelligence hub. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of places I could spend more time on, and eventually I just have to stop and publish the book and come up for air and then move on to other things. But that just speaks to that potential. The substantive finding that I think is sort of I explore in Secret Wars, but it's sort of a theme in a lot of my research, is the like non-competitive side of the secret side of international politics. So what I mean by that is I assumed when I started this research that most intelligence resources and the function of covert action and intelligence collection and analysis was a fundamentally competitive enterprise focused on adversaries, focused on competitive advantage, focused on winning wars and winning Cold Wars and winning geopolitical competition. And don't get me wrong, there's a huge amount of that going on. But that example that we started with in the Korean War, where the United States knew the Soviets were flying planes. The Soviets, actually, I found evidence they predicted the Americans would figure it out, and they still did it. There was this collusive element, which I again explore in that book in that particular context. But it's more of a theme that I see running throughout here, whether it's intelligence cooperation and sharing agreements, whether it's the U.S. knowing about what other countries are doing covertly or with their intelligence assets, and not necessarily trying to change that or alter that or competitively degrade that. There's this this level of mutual tolerance that takes place. Or even explicit cooperation, when we're talking about allies sharing information, or just a tacit collusion that happens even among adversaries, that I think is a dimension of this that I didn't really understand, explored a little bit in my dissertation and the book that came from that, but continues to be something that I find interesting. And I guess is part of why I think these like cooperation agreements for intelligence infrastructure in the current book I'm working on are so interesting, because there's this like two governments finding this common cause and developing a relationship that in part is driven by these dynamics, but is not a competitive thing necessarily. It's a collaborative thing in those cases.
Yeah, interesting. So that's really interesting, and thank you for your time. That's been a good conversation.
Sure.
And for the viewer, thank you for sticking in, sticking to the whole thing, and appreciate you guys taking the time. We're going to be back soon with other episodes, so stay tuned for that. And Professor, thanks again for coming.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for invitation.
Yeah, I'll see you guys soon.
Okay, great.